The rain pounded against the windshield as James Parker maneuvered his car along the winding road. The dim glow of the streetlights barely pierced through the thick fog that clung to the trees lining the deserted highway. He checked the time on the dashboard, 11:47 p.m. Too late to be driving, but he had no choice. His last-minute business trip had gone longer than expected, and exhaustion weighed heavily on his eyelids. His phone's GPS announced that he was close to his destination, the Blackwood Inn, an old motel tucked away on the outskirts of town. The reviews were sparse and outdated, but it was the only available lodging for miles. The thought of finally getting some sleep made him press the accelerator a little harder. As he pulled into the gravel driveway of the motel, his headlights illuminated the worn wooden sign swinging slightly in the wind. The place looked abandoned, its windows dark except for the flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly, "Vacancy." James hesitated, gripping the steering wheel. Something about the place felt off, but fatigue won over hesitation. Stepping out into the cold night, he zipped up his jacket and hurried towards the front entrance. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit lobby with outdated wallpaper peeling at the edges. A small bell sat on the counter, next to an old-fashioned guest book. Behind the desk, an elderly man with sunken eyes and thin, gray hair stared at him as if he had been expecting him. "Evening," James greeted, setting his wallet on the counter. "I have a reservation, James Parker." The man nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. Without a word, he turned and retrieved a key from the wooden rack behind him. The key was old-fashioned, with a tarnished brass tag that read, "Room 7. "You're in number 7, the old man said in a hoarse whisper. "Last room down the hall." James took the key, noticing how cold it felt in his hand. "Thanks. Any good places to eat nearby?" The man simply shook his head. "Kitchen closes early. Best to stay in your room." Something about the way he said it sent a slight shiver down James's spine. He forced a polite nod, grabbed his suitcase, and headed towards the hallway. The corridor was eerily silent, the only sound being the faint buzz of a dying light bulb overhead. The faded carpet muffled his footsteps as he passed doors marked with tarnished brass numbers. Room 3, Room 5, Room 7. He paused in front of his door. The wood looked slightly warped, as if it had been exposed to moisture for too long. With a sigh, he inserted the key and twisted it. The lock clicked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, the room was just as outdated as the rest of the motel. A single lamp cast weak light across the space, revealing faded floral wallpaper and a heavy wooden dresser with a dusty mirror above it. The bed was neatly made, though the sheets looked ancient. A small television sat on a rickety stand, and a single window overlooked the parking lot, the glass fogged from the humidity outside. James tossed his suitcase onto the bed and ran a hand through his damp hair. Just one night, he reminded himself. Then, he'd be back on the road. He locked the door and kicked off his shoes before collapsing onto the mattress. The springs groaned beneath his weight, and for a brief moment, he swore he heard something shift beneath the bed. Probably just the old frame settling, he thought. Reaching for the nightstand, he turned off the lamp and let darkness consume the room. He closed his eyes, listening to the rain tapping against the window. Then he heard it. A whisper. Faint, almost indistinguishable, but definitely there. James held his breath, his pulse quickening. He strained his ears, but the only sound was the wind rattling the window pane. Shaking his head, he exhaled and rolled onto his side. Just your imagination, he muttered. Then, from the darkness, he heard it again. Closer this time. A voice. Right beside his ear. Welcome to room 7. James woke with a start, his breath ragged and uneven. His eyes darted around the room, adjusting to the darkness. The whisper that had rattled him just moments ago was gone, replaced by the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window pane. His heart pounded in his chest as he sat up, running a hand through his damp hair. Had he imagined it? Was it a dream? The clock on the nightstand blinked 3:07 a.m. in eerie red digits. Too early, yet sleep felt like an impossibility now. The room was silent, save for the occasional creaks of the old building settling. James sighed and reached for the glass of water beside the bed. As he brought it to his lips, he noticed something odd. The glass was ice cold, far colder than it should have been considering the room's temperature. He placed it back down, unease creeping into his mind. A sudden thud echoed from the corner of the room. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes darted toward the dresser, its shadowed outline barely visible in the dim glow of the clock. Slowly, he reached for his phone, using its screen's faint light to scan the room. Nothing. Just as he was about to lay back down, a new sound sent a chill through his body, a scraping noise, like fingernails dragging against wood. It came from the closet. James's pulse quickened. He had left the closet door slightly ajar when he entered, but now it stood wide open. Darkness yawned from within, swallowing the weak light of his phone. He hesitated, then swung his legs over the side of the bed, planting his feet firmly on the worn carpet. "Don't be ridiculous," he told himself. "It's just an old building. Things creak. Doors shift." Still, his body refused to relax. He rose to his feet, stepping cautiously toward the closet. The air around him felt heavier, pressing down on his chest. Reaching the door, he hesitated, his fingers hovering inches away from the wooden frame. A whisper slithered through the darkness. His breath hitched. The voice was indistinct, but it carried a chilling familiarity. It was neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft. Just there. With a sharp intake of breath, James grabbed the door handle and yanked it fully open. His phone's light spilled into the empty space. Nothing. Just his neatly hung coat and an empty shelf above. He let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head. "You're losing it, Parker." He turned back toward the bed and froze. The dresser mirror reflected his room, but something was wrong. His reflection stood perfectly still, staring straight ahead, even though James had already taken a step forward. His throat tightened. He raised a trembling hand, and his reflection followed, but with a second's delay. The air in the room turned ice cold. A deep, suffocating silence settled over everything. Then, from the mirror, his reflection smiled. James stumbled backward, slamming into the closet door. His phone fell from his grip, clattering onto the floor and plunging the room into near-complete darkness. His breath came in short gasps, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. The reflection remained unchanged, staring at him with that unnatural grin. A sound broke through the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. James whipped his head around, but the curtains were drawn. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like nails clicking against the glass. He forced himself to move, scrambling for his phone. His fingers brushed against the smooth surface just as the lamp beside the bed flickered to life on its own. The room flooded with weak yellow light. James spun back toward the mirror. His reflection was normal again. Just him, wide-eyed and breathless. The tapping at the window had stopped. For several moments, he stood frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. But the room remained still. Slowly, his muscles unclenched, though the feeling of being watched never left him. Determined to shake the paranoia, he forced himself to the window and yanked the curtains aside. Nothing. The rain continued to drizzle, and beyond the parking lot, the motel sign flickered weakly in the night. No signs of movement. No one outside. Shaking his head, he shut the curtains and returned to the bed. His body ached with exhaustion, but sleep felt further away than ever. He lay down, keeping the lamp on this time. His eyes remained locked on the ceiling, listening. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Just as he began to drift off, the closet door creaked open behind him. And something inside breathed. James woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains, his body stiff from a restless night. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and glanced toward the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just as he had left it before sleep finally claimed him. But something felt different. The air in the room was thick, heavy with something unseen yet unmistakable. Determined to shake the unease clinging to his chest, he dressed quickly and decided to head down to the motel lobby. Maybe a cup of coffee and some fresh air would help clear his mind. As he stepped into the hallway, he noticed how eerily quiet the motel was. No sounds of other guests, no murmurs from staff, just an unsettling stillness. The front desk clerk from the previous night was still there, staring at James with the same hollow gaze. The old man's expression remained unreadable as James approached. "Morning," James muttered, forcing a smile. "Rough night. You wouldn't happen to have any coffee, would you?" The old man exhaled slowly, as if considering his words before answering. "Coffee's in the lounge. But you don't look like someone who just had a rough night. You look like someone who saw something." James stiffened. "Excuse me?" The clerk leaned in slightly. "Room 7 does things to people. Brings things out of the past, things that were never meant to leave." James frowned. What the hell does that mean? He hadn't mentioned his room number. How did the old man know? The clerk tapped a bony finger on the counter. "You should check out, son. While you still can." A chill ran down James's spine, but he forced himself to stay composed. "What happened in that room?" The old man sighed, rubbing his temples. "Many things. Too many to count. But there's one story that sticks with me more than the others." "You want to hear it?" James hesitated, then nodded. The clerk's voice dropped to a whisper. "Back in the late 50s, there was a traveling salesman. Came through here just like you. Rented room 7 for the night. Friendly guy, but folks around town said he wasn't quite right. Kept talking about how he felt like something was following him. Said he saw things in mirrors that weren't really there." He paused, his eyes flickering toward the lounge as if checking for eavesdroppers. "One night, he went mad. The guests in the room next to us heard him screaming. By the time the manager got to him, the man had scratched something into the walls with his own fingernails. Words, the kind that no one should ever see." James felt his pulse quicken. "What did he write?" The old man swallowed hard. "He wrote, 'It's watching me from the mirror.' And then he was gone. Just gone. Room was locked from the inside, but when they broke it down, there was no trace of him. Only the writing on the wall, carved deep into the wood." James shivered. He remembered the mirror in his room. The way his reflection had lingered, how it had smiled. "What happened to the room after that?" he asked. The old man sighed. "We tried closing it off, boarding it up. But every time we did, someone forced it open again. People keep renting it, even when we try to warn them. And every now and then, they don't check out." James swallowed hard. "And you still rent it out?" "I don't. The motel does. It chooses." James didn't know how to respond to that. He turned away, heading toward the lounge, trying to process what he had just heard. Maybe it was just a story. A way to scare guests, a local legend to keep people talking about this rundown place. But if that were true, why did his stomach twist into knots every time he thought about that mirror? He needed answers. He needed to go back to room 7. James hesitated at the threshold of room 7, his fingers tightening around the cold brass handle. The old clerk's words haunted him. Room 7 does things to people. He took a slow, steadying breath before stepping inside. The air was heavier than before, thick with a scent he couldn't quite place, damp wood, old fabric, and something faintly metallic. The moment he closed the door behind him, the silence became oppressive. He told himself it was just his imagination, just the weight of exhaustion and suggestion pressing down on him. But when he passed the mirror above the dresser, he couldn't help but glance at his reflection. Nothing was out of place. Still, he avoided looking at it for too long. He set his phone on the nightstand and checked the time. 10:43 p.m. Too early for bed, but his body ached from tension. He turned on the lamp, its dim yellow light flickering slightly before stabilizing. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse with the movement. With a sigh, he lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the old man's story. "It's watching me from the mirror." James squeezed his eyes shut, willing sleep to take him quickly. But when it came, it was anything but restful. He was in the room, but it was different. The bed was stripped bare, the dresser cracked down the middle. The air was colder, filled with the stench of mildew and something sour. A faint humming noise vibrated through the walls. He turned toward the mirror and immediately regretted it. His reflection wasn't right. The other James was standing still, staring back at him with wide, empty eyes. His mouth curled into a slow, deliberate grin that James himself was not making. His hands, limp at his sides, began to twitch, his fingers flexing and contorting as if controlled by invisible strings. James tried to step back, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen, watching as his reflection took a step forward. The glass didn't stop him. He walked through it, emerging into the room like a shadow peeling itself from a surface. The humming grew louder. James wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. The other James reached for him, its grin widening unnaturally, stretching past the limits of human anatomy. Its fingers brushed against his arm. James jerked awake with a gasp, his heart slamming against his ribs. His skin was slick with sweat, his hands trembling as he gripped the sheets. The room was exactly as he had left it. The mirror was intact. His reflection was normal. But the closet door was open, and he was sure he had closed it before going to sleep. A slow, deliberate creak filled the room as the door inched further open. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing the weak glow of the bedside lamp. James didn't move. Couldn't move. Then came the whisper. Not from the closet. Not from the mirror. It came from right beside his bed. "You're not supposed to be here." James's breath hitched in his throat. The whisper had been close, too close. His body remained rigid, his mind racing between fight and flight. Slowly, he turned his head toward the source of the voice, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing was there. But the air was thick with the presence of something unseen, something watching. James forced himself to move, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His feet hit the floor with a dull thud, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that clung to room 7. The closet door was still open. A darkness deeper than shadow loomed inside, untouched by the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it alone, to flee this place and never look back. Instead, he took a step forward. Each breath was shallow, controlled. He reached the closet, his fingers trembling as he grasped the door and pushed it open fully. The hinges groaned in protest. His phone's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Just a few wire hangers and an empty shelf. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. His eyes caught something, small, faint scratches etched into the back wall of the closet. Frowning, he moved closer, letting the light trace the markings. At first, they seemed random, but as his fingers brushed against the indentations, he realized they formed letters. Words. "It sees me." James recoiled, his pulse spiking. The phrase was scratched over and over, layer upon layer, as if whoever had written it had done so in frantic, desperate repetition. He swallowed hard. What the hell? The temperature in the room plummeted. A breath of icy air brushed against his neck. He spun around. The mirror. His reflection stood there, staring back, but something was wrong. His chest tightened as he studied it. The James in the mirror was standing too still, his expression vacant. And then, slowly, deliberately, his reflection smiled. James stumbled back, colliding with the closet door. The reflection didn't mimic him. It watched. And then, it moved. Not in sync, not like a normal reflection. It lifted a hand, dragging its fingers across the glass as if trying to push through. The markings behind James glowed faintly in the mirror's reflection, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then, a whisper slithered through the room. "Run." The lamp flickered violently. James didn't hesitate. He lunged for the door, yanking it open just as the mirror shattered behind him, glass spraying across the room. He bolted into the hallway, his breath ragged, his mind screaming at him to keep moving. But as he reached the lobby, the old clerk was already waiting for him, his expression grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" the old man murmured. James could barely form words. "What the hell is happening in that room?" The clerk sighed, glancing toward the hallway James had just fled. "You've been marked, son. You should have never stayed in room 7. James clenched his fists. "Marked? What does that mean?" The old man didn't answer right away. He simply nodded toward the motel's entrance. "You need to leave. Now, before it decides you belong to it." James turned toward the door, his mind spinning. But deep down, he already knew. He wasn't leaving room 7 that easily. James stood frozen at the motel's entrance, his body tense with the need to flee, yet his mind shackled by something unseen. The old clerk's warning echoed in his head. "You've been marked." But marked by what? And why did he feel as if room 7 still had its claws in him, refusing to let him go? The cold night air hit his face as he stepped outside, his breath fogging up instantly. His car sat in the parking lot, an island of safety in an ocean of darkness. His instinct screamed at him to run, to drive as far from this cursed motel as possible. Yet, as he approached his car, a sharp pain bloomed at the back of his neck. James winced, reaching up to touch the spot. His fingers came away damp. Blood. His reflection in the driver's side window was distorted, flickering like a faulty transmission. And then, for the briefest second, it wasn't his face staring back at him. It was something else. James jerked back, his breath ragged. The door was locked. His shaking hands fumbled for the keys, but as he tried to slide them into the lock, a whisper slithered through the night air. "You left something behind." His blood ran cold. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. James turned sharply. The motel stood silently behind him, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat. The lobby windows were dark, and yet, deep in the hallway leading to the rooms, he swore he saw movement. A shadow. Waiting. Watching. The pain in his neck intensified, searing hot, as if something was trying to burrow beneath his skin. James gritted his teeth. His legs felt heavy, unwilling to obey the command to leave. No, I'm done with this place." But was the place done with him? He sucked in a breath and took a step back toward the motel. The shadow in the hallway shifted, retreating further into the darkness. A challenge or an invitation? James clenched his fists. He had two choices: run from something he would never understand, or face whatever had marked him. With a final glance at his car, he turned and walked back toward room 7. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers welcomed him home. James stood frozen at the motel's entrance, his body tense with the need to flee, yet his mind shackled by something unseen. The old clerk's warning echoed in his head. "You've been marked." But marked by what? And why did he feel as if room 7 still had its claws in him, refusing to let him go? The cold night air hit his face as he stepped outside, his breath fogging up instantly. His car sat in the parking lot, an island of safety in an ocean of darkness. His instinct screamed at him to run, to drive as far from this cursed motel as possible. Yet, as he approached his car, a sharp pain bloomed at the back of his neck. James winced, reaching up to touch the spot. His fingers came away damp. Blood. His reflection in the driver's side window was distorted, flickering like a faulty transmission. And then, for the briefest second, it wasn't his face staring back at him. It was something else. James jerked back, his breath ragged. The door was locked. His shaking hands fumbled for the keys, but as he tried to slide them into the lock, a whisper slithered through the night air. "You left something behind." His blood ran cold. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. James turned sharply. The motel stood silently behind him, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat. The lobby windows were dark, and yet, deep in the hallway leading to the rooms, he swore he saw movement. A shadow. Waiting. Watching. The pain in his neck intensified, searing hot, as if something was trying to burrow beneath his skin. James gritted his teeth. His legs felt heavy, unwilling to obey the command to leave. No, I'm done with this place. But was the place done with him? He sucked in a breath and took a step back toward the motel. The shadow in the hallway shifted, retreating further into the darkness. A challenge or an invitation? James clenched his fists. He had two choices: run from something he would never understand, or face whatever had marked him. With a final glance at his car, he turned and walked back toward room 7. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, and the whispers welcomed him home. James's scream caught in his throat as the figure lunged from the closet. The darkness wrapped around him like a shroud, pulling him into its abyss. He tried to fight, his hands clawing at the doorframe, but the force was relentless. The motel room blurred, its dim yellow light swallowed by the void. And then, silence. James hit the ground hard. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the scent of damp earth and decay. His ears rang, his body aching from the impact. He pushed himself up, his fingers sinking into cold, uneven ground. Where was he? The motel room was gone. He stood in a long, narrow corridor, its walls pulsing like something alive. The air crackled with static, shadows shifting unnaturally along the walls. Dim, flickering light bulbs hung overhead, casting elongated, writhing silhouettes. A sound echoed down the hall. Footsteps. James's heart pounded as he turned toward the noise. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, yet he knew something was coming. Then, a whisper brushed against his ear. "You shouldn't have come back." James spun, but no one was there. Only the corridor, stretching on and on, warping at the edges like a bad signal. His breath came fast and shallow as the whispering continued, seeping from the walls, the ceiling, the very air around him. "Keep moving." He forced his feet forward, the ground feeling less solid with each step. The corridor twisted, narrowing, the walls pressing closer. The whispering voices grew frantic, overlapping into an unintelligible cacophony. Then he saw it. A door. Identical to room 7's door, standing alone in the endless corridor. Its brass handle gleamed under the flickering light, untouched by the decay around it. A cold dread coiled in his stomach. He knew he shouldn't open it. But the footsteps behind him were getting closer. Closer. With a shaking hand, he grasped the handle and pushed. The door swung open, revealing his motel room. Pristine. Untouched. The bed neatly made. The mirror whole. As if nothing had happened. James hesitated, then stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The room was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. His eyes darted to the mirror. His reflection was gone. And then, slowly, something inside the glass began to move.